You know how it is when you're trying to get your head around a really significant idea, something that could, well, give you a completely new way of seeing things.
Yeah,
And
definitely.
the thought of slogging through some huge, dense book can feel totally overwhelming.
Uh-huh.
Well, that's exactly why we're here. We've done that initial sort of deep dive for you.
Yeah.
Today, we're exploring Pietro Ubaldi's Principles of a New Ethics.
And this isn't just, another book of moral advice. It's more fundamental. Ubaldi's looking at the very roots of our understanding of right and wrong,
Right.
how it changes over time and how that connects to, well, everything really, how societies are structured, what's going on inside each of us. It's a really rich source of ideas.
Absolutely. So what we want to try and do today is pull out the most crucial insights, the real nuggets from Ubaldi's work. We're going to focus on his perspective on how our ethical understanding evolves.
Mhm.
The fascinating different levels of human awareness he identifies, and how all of this influences how we view authority, what we consider fair, and even maybe the direction our own lives take.
Yeah, our destiny, essentially.
Yeah,
Yep.
think of this as your kind of fast track to grasping the core of Ubaldi's pretty profound thinking, but without getting too bogged down. Okay, so let's unpack this evolution idea first.
Okay. So Ubaldi sees ethics not as some fixed set of rules that have always existed, but as something that's constantly developing, progressive.
Okay.
He talks about a progression from what he calls AS, which he links to involution, a kind of winding down or simplification, maybe towards S, which represents evolution, growth, complexity.
ASNS, got it.
And what's interesting is how different ideas about right and wrong look depending on where you are sort of on that spectrum.
Right, so if you're in that involuted state, that AS state, ethics is really about, well, basic survival, isn't it?
Pretty much. It's the law of the struggle, the
Yeah.
selection of the strongest, instincts driving behavior. That's the core of it.
And obedience. How does that work there?
Obedience is just blind. It's driven purely by fear of punishment or, the desire for reward. There's not really space for genuine understanding. It actually hinders it, he argues.
Okay, so it's very transactional, no why involved.
Exactly. At this stage, it's more instinct than intellect guiding actions. And this means those in charge don't really feel the need to explain themselves. They just expect people to follow based on those basic drivers: fear, self-interest. The capacity to grasp complex ethical ideas isn't fully online yet.
But then as we evolve, as we move towards that S state, the ethics changes.
Completely. Ubaldi says our ethics shift towards things like justice, fairness, honesty. Even using force changes, it becomes about defending justice, not just asserting power.
And here's where it gets really interesting. You mentioned the clash between these views.
Yeah, this is crucial. Those still operating primarily from the AS perspective often look at this more evolved S, ethics, justice, honesty, and just see it as totally unrealistic, utopian, maybe even naive or weak.
Because it doesn't fit the survival of the fittest model they understand.
Precisely. What seems like impractical idealism from one viewpoint is actually understood as a more advanced, more functional way of organizing ourselves from the other.
But Ubaldi cuts through the labels, right? He says the real division isn't about groups we belong to.
Exactly. He stresses that the real divide, the fundamental split, he calls it a vertical revolution in human existence. It's between those who act justly and those who act unjustly. That's the core distinction, regardless of any other affiliations.
Okay, so that difference in ethical understanding leads to different ways of actually living life, different methods.
Yes, definitely. He talks about the involuted tending to operate using a method of force and astuteness.
Astuteness meaning cleverness, cunning.
Yeah, basically getting ahead however you can, brute force or sly manipulation, whatever works. But as we evolve towards S, this shifts. The method becomes one of justice and honesty. Integrity becomes the main guide.
And that must radically change how we see authority and rules.
Oh, absolutely. In those earlier AS stages, authority relies heavily on blind faith, unquestioning acceptance, and that fear of consequences we talked about. You obey because you're told to.
And that actually holds back intellectual growth, you said.
That's his point. It stifles the development of critical thinking. But as we evolve intellectually as individuals and as a species, we start demanding reasons. We need justification.
We want to understand why before we follow a law willingly.
Precisely. Ubaldi argues humanity is actually outgrowing that need for blind faith. We're entering a time, or maybe we should be entering a time, where everything needs to be explained with sincerity and justice for laws to be genuinely, willingly obeyed.
People won't just buy it because someone says so.
Not anymore, not the evolving consciousness. They need to see the fairness, the logic.
It feels like this ties into how we understand bigger concepts too, like, well, like God. Does he talk about that?
He does touch on it. The way it's presented in the text, God isn't some, simplistic being you can trick or appease easily. Instead, God embodies, or is, a fundamental law woven into the very fabric of existence. It's inherent in the universe.
Like a law of physics almost, but for morality.
Sort of, but more encompassing. It governs cause and effect on all levels. So any attempts to evade this law through cleverness, astuteness, or deceit are ultimately futile. They just don't work in the long run.
So you might think you're getting away with something.
But you're really only deceiving yourself. The consequences, the effects of your actions according to this law will eventually manifest. Ubaldi uses the analogy. It's like trying to ignore gravity. You can jump, but you will come down. The law operates regardless of whether you believe in it or try to trick it.
Okay, that's a powerful idea. So we've got evolving ethics, changing methods of life, shifting views on authority. Now, you mentioned Ubaldi zooms in on the individual level, too, these 3 biological levels.
Yes, this is his model of consciousness within the individual. He talks about 3 distinct levels of the ego, or the self. There's the subconscious, which he calls the inferior ego, then the conscious, the sort of average ego, and finally the superconscious, the superior ego.
And he uses that light analogy. Infrared, visible, ultraviolet.
Yeah, it's an interesting way to think about it, suggesting different frequencies or vibrations of vital energy or consciousness associated with each level. Infrared for the subconscious, visible light for the conscious, and ultraviolet for the superconscious.
Okay, so let's dig into these biotypes, as he calls them. The subconscious level, what's characteristic there?
Someone functioning primarily at the subconscious level is really driven by their instincts, their immediate emotions, basic needs, and wants. Survival, procreation, basic drives.
So very reactive.
Very reactive, often impulsive. The focus is on satisfying those urges now. Rational thought, long-term planning, consider decisions that they aren't really the main drivers here. It's the realm of our more primal self.
Okay, and then moving up, the conscious level, the average ego.
Here, the intellect starts to really develop and play a major role. There's a growing capacity for logical reasoning, for rational thought.
So you can start to control those instincts.
Exactly. There is an effort to exercise control over the more basic impulses. Someone at this conscious level is actively seeking knowledge, trying to understand the world through reason, through learning. They're navigating life using your mind, essentially.
And then the top level, the superconscious, the superior ego, what defines that? Sounds quite advanced.
It is. The superconscious individual is presented as someone who has achieved a kind of completeness, a state of wholeness. They possess deep understanding, knowledge, maybe even wisdom that goes beyond just rational proof or logic.
So not just thinking, but knowing.
Something like that, operating on a more intuitive, perhaps spiritual level, strongly connected to universal principles, to truth. For them, many of the big questions are sort of answered or experienced directly. It's a higher state of awareness.
And the key thing is, we tend to operate mostly from one level.
That's the idea. Individuals tend to function predominantly at one of these levels, and this fundamentally shapes how they perceive reality, how they behave, what motivates them, and ultimately the course their lives take their destiny.
And you can see how conflicts might arise when people from different levels interact, right? Your whole reality is different.
Absolutely. Different values, different motivations, different understandings of cause and effect. Which leads us naturally into the whole concept of destiny itself. Ubaldi argues it's definitely not just random chance.
Okay, so how does he see destiny working?
Well, according to him, each of us comes into this life carrying a sort of type of destiny. But it's crucial to understand this isn't some arbitrary fate imposed from outside.
So not predetermined in a rigid way.
Not rigid, no. It's more like a logical outcome, a trajectory based on the qualities, tendencies, and the karmic balance, if you like, that we've developed over previous existences. It's cause and effect playing out across lifetimes, all governed by that underlying universal law.
So this is where reincarnation becomes absolutely essential to his framework.
It really is. You can't fully grasp his ideas on personality development or destiny without it. He emphasizes that our current life is just one chapter, one step in a very long evolutionary journey.
And the experiences, the lessons learned, the characteristics we build up over many lives, they all shape who we are now.
Exactly. They shape our starting point in this life, our inherent tendencies, and the general pattern or direction our life is likely to follow.
So thinking back to the ASS distinction, someone in that involuted state would approach destiny very differently from someone more evolved.
Oh, completely differently. Those operating more from that AS or involuted perspective tend to see themselves as isolated units. They feel they have to rely solely on their own strength, their own force, their own cunning to carve out their future against a hostile or indifferent world.
Kind of fighting against the tide.
Yeah, or trying to manipulate it. Whereas those who are more aligned with the S state, the evolved consciousness, they understand interconnection. They see themselves as part of a larger system, a larger flow.
So they try to work with the law.
Precisely. They strive to understand and align themselves with the universal law, trusting in a bigger picture, a greater justice, recognizing that their actions have consequences within that interconnected web. They have more faith in the process, you could say.
And what about negative experiences like suffering? How does that fit in? Is it just bad luck for the involuted?
Not in Ubaldi's view. He sees suffering as a really potent, though often unwelcome, teacher.
A teacher. How so?
By experiencing the consequences of our errors, our misalignments with the law, basically. When our actions based on egoism or ignorance lead to painful outcomes we learn, pain acts as feedback, a course correction.
So it guides us back towards understanding the law, towards more just actions.
Yes. That's the idea. It helps us learn the universal order and our place within it, often through trial and error, unfortunately.
Okay. Now, Ubaldi also talks about this constant push and pull, doesn't he, within us and in the world, this struggle between S and AS.
Yes, this is a central theme, this ongoing tension, this battle between the forces of evolution, growth, unity, love, essentially, what we might call good, that's the S, and the opposing impulses of involution, decline, separation, egoism, the AS.
And this isn't just an internal thing.
No, it plays out everywhere, within each individual, within families, societies, nations. This fundamental duality influences our personal ethical choices, our behavior, how we structure our societies, our laws, everything.
So you mentioned earlier that the AS perspective might misunderstand S ethics. Does that apply to virtues too?
Absolutely. Qualities that are valued from the S perspective, things like cooperation, altruism, forgiveness, might be seen completely differently from the AS viewpoint.
How so?
They might be misinterpreted as weakness, foolishness, or even a kind of disorder because they don't align with the might makes right or look out for number one logic of the involuted state.
And he brings this into how institutions operate, like religion.
Yes, he suggests that historically, major institutions, including organized religion, have often had to adapt their message and practices to resonate with the dominant mentality of the population, which has frequently been more towards the AS end of the spectrum.
Meaning they sometimes had to compromise.
It could lead to compromises, yes. A watering down of deeper principles, perhaps, leading to a more superficial adherence, focusing on rituals or dogma rather than the core spiritual or ethical transformation.
Okay, so if this struggle between S and AS is so fundamental, how do we actually make progress? How do we consciously move towards that S state, towards growth and honesty and unity?
Well, Ubaldi has some interesting, maybe even challenging ideas here. He proposes that true, deep honesty often arises from directly experiencing the painful consequences of dishonesty.
Learning the hard way, essentially.
Pretty much. And similarly, he suggests that humanity as a whole will likely only learn the profound value of peace through the intense suffering caused by war. The negative experience forces a reevaluation.
Wow, that's a sobering thought. It's not an easy path he outlines.
It isn't portrayed as easy, no. But the core of genuine personal progress, according to Ubaldi, lies in consciously shifting the balance of power within ourselves.
From the lower ego to the higher.
Exactly. Moving away from being primarily driven by the subconscious, instinctive, self-serving, inferior ego towards manifesting the potential of the conscious and ultimately the superconscious, superior ego.
And he mentions a method for this. Spiritual psychoanalysis.
Yes, he introduces that idea. It seems to be a process of deep self-understanding and conscious effort to sublimate or refine those lower instincts, transforming their energy toward higher purposes. It's about accelerating our own evolutionary journey.
And knowing your biotype, your dominant level, would be key to that.
Crucial. You need to understand where you're starting from, which forces are strongest within you to effectively work on that transformation.
Okay, one more big piece feels important here. Love. Where does love fit into this grand scheme of ethics and evolution?
Love is fundamental to the S principle in Ubaldi's view. He sees it as a primary impulse, a force that naturally seeks unity, connection, and overcomes egoism and separation.
So it's the direct opposite of the divisive nature of AS.
Precisely. Love unifies, AS divides. He also discusses how societies seem to cycle through different ethical focuses, sometimes emphasizing love, connection, well-being, what he calls sexophilic periods,
Okay.
and other times emphasizing aggression, conquest, power, sexophobic periods. He sees these cycles as being driven by underlying biological needs for balance and the overall push towards evolution, even if the path isn't always smooth.
So the answer isn't to suppress powerful instincts like love or sexuality.
No, not at all. Repression isn't the goal. True progress lies in nobling these instincts, refining them, and directing their powerful energy towards higher evolutionary aims, towards greater unity, understanding, and connection, using the power of love consciously.
Okay. So as we start to kind of wrap this up, we've covered a huge amount of ground from Ubaldi's principles of a new ethics. If you had to boil it down, what are the absolute key takeaways for our listeners?
Gosh, okay. Firstly, I'd say the core idea that ethics isn't fixed. It evolves. We're moving, hopefully, from a state based on struggle and instinct towards one based on justice and conscious understanding. It's fundamental.
Right, the AS to S progression.
Exactly. Secondly, the concept of those three levels of consciousness, subconscious, conscious, superconscious. Understanding that the level we primarily operate from deeply shapes our reality, our actions, our destiny.
Hmm.
Thirdly, the idea of destiny itself not being random fate, but the logical consequence of cause and effect playing out over lifetimes according to universal law. Reincarnation is key there.
Okay.
And finally, I think recognizing that constant struggle, that tension within us and within society between the lower separative impulses of A's and the higher unifying drive of S.
It really does offer a powerful lens, doesn't it?
Yeah.
For looking at ourselves, human behavior, societal dynamics.
Absolutely. Once you start thinking in these terms, evolutionary ethics, levels of consciousness, the law, it can provide some really valuable insights into why things are the way they are and maybe how they could be different. It helps make sense of a lot of complexity.
So here's something for everyone listening to maybe mull over. As you've heard about these ideas, especially the different levels of consciousness, which one feels most dominant in your own life right now? Just consider that.
Yeah, that's a good reflection point.
And then think about how understanding Ubaldi's perspective on the law, on destiny as consequence, on this evolution of ethics,
Yeah.
how might that actually influence the choices you make, the path you decide to take moving forward?
Big questions.
They are big questions, but potentially really significant ones for personal growth, and maybe even for how we think about the future of society. If any of this deep dive has sparked your interest, we definitely encourage you to explore Pietro Ubaldi's Principles of a New Ethics further for yourself.
It's definitely challenging stuff, but very rewarding if you stick with it. Gives you a lot to think about.